Hi, welcome to the Organization Root Administrator Client Project Resource Deployments video session. Staffing Organization Root Administrator deploys resources in client projects from its resource pool. Staffing Organization's resource pool consists of the regular employees, contractors, and the vendor resources. Click on Clients submenu under the Client Management menu item. In the Client's user interface, click on the Projects link for a client to get to the user interface for clients' projects. Click on Deployments link for a project to get to the user interface for client project resource deployments. Let's take a look at the user interface. The top portion shows the details of the projects, including the project start date and project end date. The bottom portion shows the resource deployments. As you see, a regular employee and a vendor resource are deployed in this project. Click on View link of a deployment, say for the regular employee deployment, to see the deployment details, including deployment start date and deployment end date. Notice the link, Disengage Prematurely, for the regular employee resource. Because of some reasons like resignation, absconding, unfortunate death, it might be required to disengage a resource before the deployment end date. But premature disengagement is not just about setting a disengagement date. Lots of data integrity like pending timesheet submission, engagement in other projects, etc., must be checked to set a feasible effective date for disengagement. WFMA does this complex check for the Staffing Organization Root Administrators. Click on the Disengage Prematurely link for the regular employee deployment. In the dialog box, Staffing Organization Root Administrator has to enter the reason for premature deployment. Following that, a premature disengagement date has to be entered by the Staffing Organization Root Administrator. An abrupt disengagement date may be rejected by WFMA. Inputting a disengagement date through trial and error method does not make sense. In this context, WFMA helps the Staffing Organization Root Administrator by providing a suggestion on inputting a feasible disengagement date. WFMA performs a complex check on the current data state and integrity for the subject resource and figures out a date range for a feasible disengagement date. The suggestion is provided in red color. Also, it is very important for the Staffing Organization Root Administrator to read the note before confirming the premature disengagement. Upon setting a premature disengagement date, WFMA keeps track of it continuously. As soon as the disengagement date matches the current date, the deployment record shows up with a remark marked for expiry, and the record gets highlighted in red. Let's look into the vendor resource deployment record, which is highlighted in red and with a remark marked for expiry. Apart from premature disengagement, as explained earlier, there could be other reasons for a deployment to be marked for expiry, like the vendor resource might have been separated from the respective vendor, or the resource's deployment date is over, or the vendor contract for the vendor resource might have been expired. Whatever is the reason, WFMA keeps track of all the deployed resources in all the projects, in all the clients, and in all the staffing organizations. Any deployment record meeting the marked for expiry criteria gets highlighted in red. The highlighted record draws the attention of the Staffing Organization Root Administrator, who can expire the deployment online by clicking the Expire link. If the resource deployment expiry task is set to automatic mode, the deployment will be expired automatically. Otherwise, the Staffing Organization Root Administrator can expire the deployment online by clicking the Expire link. Upon expiry, the resource gets disengaged from the project, and the disengaged column shows checked. Before applying the expire action, the disengagement date can be revised by the Staffing Organization Root Administrator by clicking the Disengage Prematurely link. Click on the Add button to get to the user interface for deploying a resource to the client project. Let's look into the user interface. There are some important fields to enter data. Any client project deployment is done against a client contract. Staffing Organization Root Administrator has to select the client contract against which this deployment is being done. Upon selecting a contract, corresponding client contract start date and client contract end date get displayed. This helps the staffing organization route administrator setting the deployment start date and end date properly. Any type of resource can be deployed by selecting the appropriate radio button. If resource type, employee regular, is selected, the regular contractor employee list box shows only the regular employees of the organization in the list. The staffing organization route administrator can select a specific regular employee from the list. While selecting a resource, the list box shows the bandwidth availability percentage of the resources in the list. Available bandwidth less than 100% means the resource is already deployed in some other projects, which consumed the resource's bandwidth, as per the bandwidth allocation percentage in those project deployments. However, bandwidth availability percentage is just an indication for the staffing organization HR and the resource, which guides the staffing organization route administrator to allocate bandwidth for the current deployment. But even if the cumulative bandwidth crosses 100%, WFMA allows the deployment. It's just a guideline for not crossing total allocation more than 100% as part of good HR practice. Notice that Contractor Contracts list box is disabled because a regular employee cannot have a contract, and thus for a regular employee resource, contract reference entry is irrelevant. The staffing organization route administrator has to enter resource rate, resource OT rate, and rate unit for the subject regular employee deployment, as per the negotiation and contract done with the client. If resource type, contractor employee, is selected, the regular contractor employee list box shows only the contractor employees of the organization in the list. The staffing organization route administrator can select a specific contractor employee from the list. Upon selecting a contractor employee, the Contractor Contracts list box shows only the contracts for the subject contractor employee. The staffing organization route administrator has to select a contractor contract for the contractor employee. Upon selecting a contractor contract, contract document reference, contract start date, and contract end date get displayed, which helps the staffing organization route administrator setting the deployment start date and end date properly. Contractor contract for a contractor employee has resource rate, resource OT rate, and rate unit. When the contractor contract is selected, the contractual values get populated in the resource rate, resource OT rate, and rate unit fields for this client deployment. This provides a guideline to the staffing organization route administrator setting the contractor employee resources rate, OT rate, and even the rate unit for this client deployment. If resource type, vendor resource, is selected, the vendor resources list box gets enabled. Regular contractor employee and contractor contracts are relevant for vendor resource deployment. The vendor resources list box shows only the vendor resources for whom contracts are made with all the vendors of the staffing organization. Notice that in the list, along with the vendor resources, corresponding vendor contract reference is shown. That means a vendor resource may be attached to more than one vendor contracts with different rates and other criteria. Upon selecting a vendor resource contractor combination, contract document reference, contract start date, and contract end date get displayed, which helps the staffing organization route administrator setting the deployment start date and end date properly. Vendor contract for a vendor resource has resource rate, resource OT rate, and rate unit. When the vendor contract is selected, the contracted values get populated in the resource rate, resource OT rate, and rate unit fields for this client deployment. This provides a guideline to the staffing organization route administrator setting the vendor resources rate, OT rate, and even the rate unit for this client deployment. Fill in allocation percent and deployment start date and end date, and click on Submit button to create the deployment. Thank you. See you in the next video.